Hello, and welcome to the ThrillWorks Trade Talk, the first one of 2021. I'm Doug Riches. I'm going to be the host of this fantastic group of people that we've assembled to talk about how banks are leading the move to headless CMS and the tools and technologies that they're using to gain an advantage. So first off, I just want to do a quick introduction of who we have on the call today. So as I said, I'm Doug. We have Mark Demney. He's the Director of Content Management Strategy from Contentful. We have Jason Ball, staff software engineer at Gatsby. And we have Michael Zubarev. He's the Senior Development Manager of Engineering Customer Solution Delivery at PC Financial. So welcome to our panelists. We're going to be talking with all of them shortly. So first, I want to take you through a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. And I think, one of the most important things that I always try and bear in mind when I'm looking at, new solutions or different ways of approaching technology is that there's no one size fits all solution for everyone, and that really, you really want to focus on what's going to work best for your team, what's going to work best for your end customers, and how do you make sure that all the kind of the boxes are checked from that perspective. So we're going to talk in this webinar about really kind of a new way of thinking about content and code. We're going to start from a web and mobile perspective, but really we're going to talk a lot about the idea of omni-channel, different channels that we can help to service our customers and clients. We're of course focusing on the banking side of things. So Michael's going to provide us some insight from a PC Financial perspective and how this has kind of helped them and some of the learnings that we've got out of that. And we're really going to focus, on both the business side of things and a little bit on the technical side. At the end of the panel, we're going to have opportunity for you to ask questions. So there is a Q&A button that you should see on your screen there. Feel free as we're going along to add in questions. We're going to try and answer as many of those as we possibly can. If we can't get to all of them, we are going to try and do our best to answer them in writing and post those after the webinar as well. So first, let's take a look at kind of the global banking landscape. And one of the things that is always important when we're having these conversations is to have an understanding of the context of where are we at today with banking and technology and banking customers in general. So, I really hope that, a lot of content in banks isn't being hosted on mainframes, but, when we talk about the idea of mainframes still being in use at banks, it kind of speaks a little bit to some of the stereotypes, if you will, about how banks are perceived, even internally from my experience talking with multiple banks over the years, is that this idea that you might have a mainframe, still working to use that, etc. And some of the technology that we're using is still the same that existed in 1999. Well, if it ain't broken, why fix it? Might be kind of the question that you would ask yourself. And in fact, I would ask myself that same question in your shoes. And really what we really want to think about is is the technology doing the job in the way that we need? And I think this is where some of the next insights come in. But, that traditional way of thinking about technology, we do need to evaluate that. And is it actually solving the problems that we need to solve? And this is one of the problems, and not problems, but opportunities even that that we're going to start to see. By 2022, 78% of US clients, and by default, 3 of the panelists, including myself, are Canadian, so across Canada and the United States. 78% of the millennial population will become digital banking users. So that has a lot of implications for the technologies that we use to service our customers. The technology that we had in 1999, did a really good job for what the web was in 1999. Today, it's a much more complex ecosystem that we're dealing with, and the expectations of users has dramatically increased. When you look at, what banks are being compared to, they're not just being compared to other banks anymore. They're being compared to the experience that a user has on Netflix, or the experience that a user has with Uber, et cetera. So being able to service those experiences, being able to reach people in the channels where they are, also requires that we take a look at the tools and technology that we're using to achieve those goals. And because of that, we're seeing this millennial switch to online banking, and increasingly seeing more and more numbers of those people, fintech is becoming more mainstream. In the U.S., we have investment tools like Robinhood. Up here in Canada, we have Wealthsimple, et cetera, who are starting to play in the same space that traditional banks might play, and they're not necessarily playing by those same rules. They don't have necessarily all the legacy and history at this point that a bank might. So how banks approach their technology and servicing those same customers when they start to compete also needs to be evaluated. We need to make sure that we're not falling behind. And of course, within banks, there's, especially large banks, there's multiple lines of business. So, banks on average, when you look at, how banks make their money is by interest, but how that's achieved varies wildly from bank to bank across the US and Canada and outside of into Europe and other places as well. So when we look at things like the credit card business versus the core banking business versus investment businesses, we have different needs that are perceived by the bank and by people who are making decisions on what that experience is. In general, holistically, we have a user like myself as an example who I have a credit card, I have a bank account, I have all these things. And we need to target both the holistic user journey across all those verticals, but as well as, speaking to the individual needs that I have as a credit card customer versus an investment customer. So from a business point of view, we need to make sure that we can, service the needs of the business, but also the needs of the customer, which can be a hard balance to strike. And then finally, less money available to do more. I think, no matter what industry you're in, this has been the story of 2020 for sure. Return on equity, which is the measure of profitability primarily for banks, has dropped 8.7%, the lowest in 3 years. So what does that mean? A lot of times teams, both on the business and IT side, are being asked to do more with less. And so when we're looking at how we approach solving problems, whether that's, public facing sites, or we're looking at online banking or other kind of solutions, across channels, we need to make sure that we're doing that in both a fiscally responsible way, but also an efficient way, because again, we are being asked to do less with more because there's less of that money to go around. So what does this mean for your business? That's a bunch of, might almost sound doom and gloom. I don't think, hopefully it didn't, but what are some of the practical implications of things we need to think about? And as we talk through the panel, we're going to start to address some of these things, hopefully, and through your Q&A as well. Hopefully we can get some good participation in that to really get this team of experts to help kind of answer some of these questions to these implications. So first off, this is an interesting statistic that we were looking at. 64% of banking CEOs say they were not able to innovate effectively due to lack of resources. And so that's an interesting challenge, because if, when we look at, some of the contexts that we have, where we have, fintech that's, coming up and starting to starting to take over some of what traditional banks might have done from a wealth management or credit card or otherwise kind of business. And they're being lean and nimble. Traditional banks also need to be able to do so. But part of the lack of resources, can also mean that, we might be spending times on things that maybe we shouldn't be. So that's one of the things that I think we're going to try and cover in the panel is how what we're going to be talking about can help to alleviate some of those strains on resourcing. And again, how do we keep pace with the expectations of retail, the business, capital market customers? A lot of banks today struggle with delays in their deployment cycles. And again, this is something that isn't just a problem with banks. We see this across enterprises where delays in development or deployment cycles because of either lack of resources or we're spending time on things that maybe we shouldn't be, that aren't providing as much value. So when we look at the need to do more with less, when we look at meeting the needs of end customers, be that millennials or otherwise, we really need to keep pace. And the implication of some of the context that banks are working in is that in general, we tend to be falling behind. And again, I'm the CTO guy. I have to throw a little bit of more technical talk in here. So what can this mean from a technical point of view? And this is something that I find interesting is that, typically when we have a monolithic service, and lack of automation can cause, additional strain on IT services. If we have the idea of things that are kind of old or spaghetti code or have been developed over time to be kind of these large monolithic monstrosities, if you will, we can get a little bit lost in dealing with those issues versus our focus on maybe being a little bit more lean and agile towards getting the right kind of results that we want to get. And another thing that ends up happening as a result of that, especially for the IT folks or the technology folks in the room, is, business owners or at banks, feel that, the IT might be a blocker for change when really, IT is trying to, do the best with what they have. And so what we're going to talk about today is the idea that we want to start to change. How do we unblock those teams? How do we make it so the business owners are able to get what they need? And how do we use the idea of headless and services and automation and more beyond that to be able to help propel you forward and gain an advantage? And so let's talk a little bit about what this can mean, banks gaining an advantage, and what are banks like PC Financial doing? So I haven't really mentioned COVID until this point, but I feel like it's obligatory at this point to make fun of 2020. Although I feel like 2021 might have said "hold my beer" in the first couple of weeks. So 2020, really taught us that we need to be able to pivot quickly. The first few months when lockdowns were happening up here in Canada and across the US as well, a lot of people panicked, especially folks who were not necessarily completed their digital transformations, people who were using legacy systems that weren't able to change on a dime, might not have been able to complete the changes that they wanted to do in the turnaround that was from basically an unexpected set of changes. And so a lot of companies really quickly started to do that and started to look at different ways of working. And luckily, PC Financial was ahead of the curve on this. So I think they did, very well. But, this is the kind of thing that, it might hopefully, knock on wood, we don't have more lockdowns and experiences like 2020, but we should always plan to be able to solve for those. And so, like I said, companies like PCF, by embracing that modern way of thinking, about their content and data, customer experience, how they develop their code, how they think about the business, how they approach their projects, really kind of removed that IT burden and enabled them to rapidly innovate and iterate upon what they needed to do within a regulated environment, which is kind of counter to what we kind of see when we look at the data out there for the context of the banking industry as a whole. Just from our perspective, working with PC Financial in 2019, we were able to complete 2 CMS projects with them before our move to Contentful, and we were able to achieve 6 to 8 after that move. So just from that perspective alone, the amount of work we were able to do with the same size team, on the ThrillWorks side, was eye-opening, to say the least. And so what's the idea? Let's get to the point, Doug. Again, this is where we're going to go through with the panel. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Shared architecture and content means that you can spin up new experiences quickly. And so really, this is the foundation of what we're going to be talking about. This is the foundation of headless CMS, about having a tool like Gatsby, and using and all the technologies that it uses and the services that Gatsby provides to be able to pivot quickly, to be able to not reinvent the wheel and to reuse that architecture. And I'm sure Mark is chomping at the bit to talk more about what that means. We utilize design systems tied to component libraries to make kind of better and more consistent UIs, to make sure that we have consistency across everything that we're doing across channels. And this isn't just a technical thing. This is from a design perspective and from a business perspective. What we're going to be looking at, that kind of end-to-end. How are we looking at components? How do we break down UI elements into something that makes sense and gets us into a consistent kind of brand message across the board? And flow, 2021 user experience is divided across multiple channels. We talked about that in the context. And so creating those seamless user journeys across channels is going to be more important than ever. People have been moving to digital, especially in, over the course of this pandemic, more than ever. And so we need to be able to have the ability to adapt quickly and be able to have a consistent message across every single channel we're using, whether it's, web and mobile as more traditional channels, but, email, voice, etc., whatever those other channels are, we can take a look at like, how do we have a holistic solution across the board? And then, we also need to be able to enable our IT teams, especially the people who are kind of working on, building out these kind of new experiences and setting it up so the business can, take ownership and take control over what's happening with a brand or a company. We need to make sure that, they're enabled to be able to do those things quickly and efficiently with less time and money to be able to complete tasks. And also that we can attract top talent. It's, I think, an important part of anything, and something that PC Financial has done a really great job of is attracting really fantastic people like Mike, who are able to solve problems. And finally, the result. What's the thing that we want to get to? We want to provide users with cross-channel clarity, speed, security, performance, and consistency across the board. So ultimately, no matter what we're doing, no matter what you're doing as a company or a brand, let's think about the context of where banking is at today. How do we get there? How do we do all these things that customers today demand, that the business demands, and move forward in a way that makes sense for yourself and your company and your team? And with that, I'm sure everyone's tired of hearing my voice, so let's bring in some other folks. So I'm going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves, and I'm also going to turn this off so you can look at all our smiling faces a little bit more. So first I'm going to have Mark Demney introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Mark Demney, and as Doug mentioned, I'm the Director of Content Management Strategy at Contentful. And Contentful is what you would commonly know as a headless CMS. And it is SaaS-based, so we deliver as software as a service. And so, we're really providing two things. We're providing the product itself, which is the CMS, and essentially the infrastructure as well. So all those things that you're thinking about as far as scalability and reliability.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. And I'm going to ask you some more questions about that really shortly. Let's go to Jason next.
Yeah, my name is Jason Ball. I work at Gatsby. Gatsby is a JavaScript-based framework for building blazing fast websites, and can work with just about any data source, including Contentful. And yeah.
Awesome. All right. And Michael.
Hey guys, I'm Michael Zubrev. I'm the Senior Development Manager at PC Bank. I primarily oversee all the different channels that we have within the organization. This includes web, mobile, that's pretty much it, web and mobile. And we've been heavily using Contentful and Gatsby in our channel or public-facing sites, as well as some of our web and mobile. So I'm really excited to show or talk about what we've done.
Awesome, thank you. So I think, for my first question, I'm going to throw it over to Mark. And Mark, maybe you can, you gave us a little bit of context about Contentful, but maybe you can give us a little more context around, why kind of forward-thinking companies like PCF are moving towards Contentful.
Sure. So, I mean, there's a lot of little reasons, and you really covered a number of them yourself already when you talked about just the number of digital experiences that you can build quicker. And that's due to a lot of different things. It's due to it being software as a service, so you can, essentially click a button and get infrastructure provision. It's due to the nature of headless content management and being able to model atomic content very quickly. It's due to having a number of SDKs and ways of working with frameworks like Gatsby to deliver front-end experiences in a number of different ways. And so it's a lot of these little things sort of incrementally that add up to, and SaaS infrastructure as well. And so it's a lot of those little things that kind of make it so that you get time to value very quickly, and you can build in a very, agile fashion as well.
Yeah. And Mark, I know we're talking about, we're talking with Gatsby obviously here today, but like you mentioned, like Gatsby, is there kind of limits from a Contentful perspective on what that kind of framework or front end, needs to be?
No, not at all. And I think that's a big part of that ecosystem. Is there's a number of players for things like site generation, things like hosting, things like digital asset management. There's really been a revolution where all of these services are really moving to a SaaS-based approach with things like microservices and things like webhooks, where you can really effectively tie these bits of infrastructure together. And so certainly I will say there's nice pairings out of the box. Like we do a lot of work with, Gatsby, hosts like Netlify, et cetera, dams like Binder and Cloudinary. Those are certainly things where, that effort has been put into place. But if you have another service that sort of adheres to those microservice and, webhook principles, then it's really a pretty trivial matter to add that into the larger, overall stack that you're building.
Yeah, and I think I would argue that that's probably one of the biggest advantages of headless that we've seen anyway, is that ability to be able to like take that approach and kind of deliver architecture and as content kind of across the board. On I used to be an iOS developer. I could connect just as easily as I could to our Gatsby sites kind of thing. So that's great. speaking of Gatsby, I'd like to maybe throw it over to Jason for a little bit. So Jason, for the folks in the audience who aren't familiar with kind of Gatsby as a stack, maybe we could talk a little bit about, what is Gatsby? What kind of things, can you do with it? What's involved from a technical and business perspective?
Sure. So Gatsby is a React-based framework, so it allows you to use React components to build web pages, and you can hook it up to just about any data source you can think of, whether it's Contentful or WordPress or any other number of CMSs, even like Google Spreadsheets, for example, or whatever. Basically, any data source you have, you can hook up to Gatsby, pipe your data into components, and the output is static pages that you can deploy to CDNs and serve on the edge. So one of your slides, you talk about speed, security, performance, and consistency, and Gatsby kind of allows you to hit all of those. The speed on development cycles and speed on user experience, you're able to hit. Security, since it's static files, there's no like live database connections or anything to build the pages for the user, like a traditional like WordPress CMS, where it's going to actually have a cycle back to the server to build the page. Performance, static, served on the edge, so super fast. And then consistency, since you're using React, you can use component libraries and make sweeping changes across your site and use like design systems or whatnot, or component libraries or whatever, to have consistent branding across many different projects. Even you could have multiple projects that use the same component libraries and have consistency, and things like tech debt cleanup as you go, like using CSS and JavaScript. It'll wipe out CSS that's not used, for example, and allow you to move faster. And yeah.
That's awesome. So it's interesting. You mentioned, a little bit about kind of React. So I have a lot of experience with React, but, I remember in the early days of building out single page applications with, React or Angular or otherwise, or even going back further, that, there was SEO implications to that. You mentioned about the static generation side of things, and performance, but can you maybe talk a little bit about like the generation side of things? Like, as a business user, why should I care about that?
Yeah, I mean, like, so anytime you change content in something like Contentful or whatever, it'll send a notice to Gatsby saying, hey, this thing changed. And then Gatsby will go through a process to rebuild whatever affected pages that thing should affect. It'll deploy it to CDN, and then and then Google or any crawlers or whatever can crawl your page faster than crawling a CMS page in most cases. So if anything, it has positive implications for SEO. You still have to follow normal like best practices for SEO, right? Having good markup and keywords and meta tags and all that stuff. But,
you still have to do the web dev part. It doesn't automatically do that for you. Okay. I was hoping, but no. Awesome. Thanks, Jason. So I'm going to pass it over to Mike for a second. So Mike, you've been using Contentful, you've been using Gatsby. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what are some of the benefits that you found with the headless approach and kind of what it's offered to PC Financial.
In terms of the approaches, the benefits, I guess, of using the headless, I think Jason talked about a lot of them, including security, high availability, and simplicity. So we, because we host all of our assets or public-facing assets on a storage bucket, there's a very unlikely chance that we'll ever go down. We'll always be highly available. There's nothing really to hack because it's all static assets that get outputted and generated. And it's very simple to host as well as to actually develop or to process through the DevOps pipeline. One of the things that I'll tell you guys, I guess, candidly, is it's actually a lot less expensive than it was before, because we don't necessarily have to host and have these large CMS boxes serving content. So it actually reduces.
Oh, we lost him again. Right when he was getting to the key point. Okay, while Mike is checking on his internet connection there, maybe I'll throw it back to, and we'll come back to what Mike's answer was, because I want to know. Maybe we'll throw it back to Mark. And Mark, maybe you can talk a little bit about, you know, Contentful
A lot
and
of our
Omni.
costs to hosting some of those.
Pray for Mike's internet. That's right. It wouldn't be, you know, like a pandemic, you know, webinar Zoom call if, you know, somebody didn't freeze. So,
How we know it's live.
Yeah, we know it's live.
The
Yeah,
proof is in the glitches.
exactly. So Mark, maybe just tell us a little bit about kind of omni-channel management within Contentful. Like, you know, we talked a little bit about the idea that, you know, we can have multiple channels, that, you know, we have millennials and others who are looking to, you know, interact with brands across, you know, in multiple ways, my phone, my desktop, my, you know, Alexa or whatever it is. If you can talk to that, to that for a bit.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two aspects to the omni-channel story, and some of those things are those newer and more exciting technologies that you're talking about. So, you know, getting content to voice tools like Alexa, or you know, IoT, you know, driving content in cars, for example. You know, and these are kind of those cutting edge stories. Of course, we've had web for a very long time. We've had mobile for a fairly long time. But I think another big part of customer experience is getting content to those channels that have been around for a while, that have been somewhat siloed. So things like FAQs and dealing with support, or things like help within applications. And, you know, if you think about customer experience, and if you're a bank, you know, there's a lot of these content sources at every part in that customer experience. There is the website, there is your you know, terms and services on your mobile app. There is terms and services and documentation that you're going to be signing, and you know, there are procedures for, you know, when you're visiting the bank in person, and that customer service, having consistency of that content across those channels, whether they're, you know, newer channels or older channels, is really key to that. And I think a lot of brands are starting to you know, certainly discover and build those new channels, but also understand what customer experience means for those channels that have actually been around for a long time, but they just really haven't pulled them into that sort of shared platform and shared governance.
Yeah, awesome. And like it makes, I'm just going to jump over to Jason for a second here, because you know, like when we talked about some, you know, some of the benefits of Gatsby before, but like, you know, specifically for banks, like when we're looking at, you know, moving from what might be like a more traditional approach from, you know, like a server rendered HTML, you know, tied in with, you know, like templates on a CMS or otherwise, whatever that is, you know, non-CMS, doesn't really matter. What are some of the benefits for banks of Gatsby? We've touched on some of them, but like if you had to kind of do a soundbite for that, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think any serving your content static is going to be a benefit for anybody. Of course, like the time to first byte for users and everything, your page is going to be super fast. People searching for content you have to offer. Like you mentioned credit cards earlier. If I'm looking for information on the credit card, if my site's faster than my competitor's site, you know, people are going to find my content ideally faster. And then there's also being a static system, there's a build step, which some people might argue is a bad thing. I think it's a great feature of what we're doing because it allows you to catch bugs before you deploy. And so it takes your content, builds the pages, and can tell you, hey, this thing's broken. You sure you want to deploy this? So that's like another benefit, is allowing anybody on your team to contribute to projects and the tools being able to say, yeah, this is good to go, or no, it's not. So those are some benefits, I think.
Yeah, and something that I wanted to touch on there, I think, because interesting, you know, and is that, you know, Gatsby isn't just the JavaScript framework for doing these things. It provides all this value, but you also have the Gatsby Cloud as well. So maybe you can talk really quickly about what that means, because I think there's some implications, you know, especially for folks like Michael and others on the call around kind of like how we make those things efficient and what it means for testing all that stuff.
Yeah, sure. So Gatsby itself is an open source project, so you can use it and host it wherever you can find hosting for it. But yeah, Gatsby Cloud is a cloud service that connects your code repository and your content. And anytime your content changes, if it has the ability to notify Gatsby Cloud, it will incrementally rebuild just the affected pages. So Gatsby by itself will normally rebuild your entire site, and every time something changes, incremental builds will just change the affected pages. So in some cases, you might have a 10-minute build with Gatsby. Incremental builds can take it down to seconds. Like in my case, I have a WordPress site that is hooked to Gatsby Cloud, and when I publish a post in WordPress, it's about 5 seconds before it's live. And then it runs Lighthouse reports for you also, so you can tie specific code changes to performance increases or decreases, and things like that. There's more tooling that'll be coming out about that, like around that type of feature set, like code quality checks and things like that as well. So it allows your teams, to just move really fast and keep your quality high, keep your performance high, catch bugs before you deploy them, things like that.
It also makes it easy to roll back to previous iterations and versions, because every build can actually have its own set of artifacts. So in the past, it actually helped us a lot tremendously when there was an error in some of the content that we delivered. We can very quickly just redeploy the previous assets. Everything gets packaged and it can be stored and then regenerated. And just in terms of Gatsby Cloud, from our perspective, a lot of times it's actually quicker than what we had before with our old CMSs. So the time to actually redeploy or to do the Delta check, the live previews, they're quite amazing and remarkable. And I urge anybody who wants to try and play with Gatsby to try the Gatsby preview.
Awesome.
One other quick thing that came to mind too, if for some reason, like you had an issue with your CMS or your backend or whatever, since Gatsby sites are static, as long as your CDN doesn't completely go down, please stop. As long as your CDN doesn't like completely tank for some reason, your backend and your front end are now actually decoupled. So you can have teams working night and day to fix something going on behind the scenes, and your site is still up. So it's the decoupling. There's real benefits to that.
Absolutely.
And from a security perspective as well, nobody can really infiltrate, because all your content and your CMS can actually be on an internal network that's not exposed to the public internet at all. So the only thing that ever gets exposed is whatever is in the actual bucket. So I think there's a lot of benefits to that decoupling from a security perspective as well.
Yeah, and that's something that's echoed across kind of all our clients that are kind of using this approach. I'm going to throw it back to Mark a little bit here, and then we'll throw it over to Michael and pray for Mike's internet.
I'm tethering; it should be better.
Very good. Yeah. Hopefully, I don't lose power here. This happened last week to us. So we talked a little bit before, and I kind of teased the fact that like this idea of like not just shared content, but shared architecture. I'd love, Mark, if you can talk a little bit about what that means from a Contentful perspective, and how we should be thinking about these kind of things.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really common to a lot of the larger Contentful clients is this concept of a shared architecture. So having things like reference spaces and tied to things like design systems. So you have pre-baked content models, you have pre-built content that in turn goes with set front-end components. And these are the types of things that, because that is built on APIs and command line tooling and various other things, you can very easily as an organization say, hey, we're going to set up a new landing page, or set up a new way of piping content to a marketing automation channel, or whatever the case may be, and really just sort of script and automate a lot of those things. And so I think this is one of those things that has more and more value as you become a bigger company. Certainly I think for smaller clients, you can still do a lot of those things by hand in, the web interface and kind of managing those things that way. But for any larger client, what they typically end up doing is just building these things out and building sort of scriptable, repeatable processes, and often even tying them to provisioning tools like ServiceNow. So you can say, hey, I'm going to log a ticket. I want to create a new website, and it's going to be e-commerce, and it's going to be tied with these things, and you have that scripted and run out of the box, and all of a sudden you get a new stack within 30 minutes. So that's really those benefits that you start to get into as you scale with larger companies.
Yeah, for sure. And I believe, Michael, maybe you can speak to how PC Financial is kind of like approaching that in particular, and shared content across channels as well. But maybe you can speak from a end user perspective how that's working for you.
Sure, yeah, for sure. So Contentful actually has all the data that we ever really display to our end users. So obviously it has the sites which are rendered by Gatsby and are publicly facing and hosted in buckets. We also have a lot of our terms and conditions and a bunch of other metadata that's required for the site or for different apps as well as the websites. So for example, in-app messaging can actually be hosted on Contentful as well, and then gets populated through a pipeline into a bucket that then can be called upon from a mobile or a web device. So we use Contentful as anything that the business needs to modify content that's dynamic within the different public sites. And then we empower the business to make those changes. And then all we do is we actually call those APIs or develop or build pipelines or buckets from that data that then we can consume on our mobile site. An interesting story, I guess I probably shouldn't share this, but when I first joined the organization, we were heavily using a CMS, and we were pulling some information and metadata from that CMS that if that CMS went down, a lot of the other services will be impacted. And shifting to a highly reliable instance by using Contentful as well as Gatsby and a different set of pipelines, we're able to really simply generate artifacts in a static content and then consume those from a mobile device. And the availability or the downtime actually immediately disappeared. And there's less maintainability from a CMS site, because if the CMS goes down, nothing else is impacted. Only whatever is the bucket is the important part.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. So quick time check. This, I think we do have about an hour and a half, but I want to, understand that people also have lunches as well. So we have a couple more questions for the panel here, and then I can see that there's some questions streaming in both in the chat and in the Q&A. If you can put it in the Q&A, your questions in the Q&A box, that will make my life a little bit easier, but I'll do my best to answer the ones that are in the chat as well, just to make sure that we do get to you. But if I miss your chat comment, I'll make sure it does get answered after the webinar if we miss it. Okay, so this one's for Jason. Jason, one of the questions that I might have if I was looking at this and wasn't aware yet is like, how does this work together? Like the Contentful and Gatsby, and Mark, you can probably guess what my question to you is going to be kind of after this. How when I'm looking at connecting those two things, if they're separated and I can use them on multiple channels, like how does Gatsby approach connecting with these different kind of data sources in general?
Yeah, so Gatsby has a plugin architecture, so you can hook into Gatsby and do cool stuff. So one of the types of plugins is called a source plugin, and that allows you to connect Gatsby to any data source you can think of. So there's a plugin, Gatsby Source Contentful, for example, that talks to Contentful APIs, pulls in the data, and then Gatsby has what's called a node layer. Like it's basically our kind of internal cache. It takes data from a source, creates nodes of data in Gatsby, and then allows you to use Gatsby GraphQL layer to talk to those nodes that are cached in Gatsby and pass that data to components. So, and it's not, you don't have to use just one data source too. Since there's this plugin architecture, we call it the content mesh. You can mesh content from many data sources. Like in in my experience, almost every company I've ever worked on a website for, they'll have a lot of their content in one CMS, and then their like career pages is always, no matter what, in some other system, like always, no matter what.
Yep.
So you could pull those in, both data sources, your Contentful and your, I don't know, whatever your job listings are on, and pull those in and use the same components in Gatsby to have that consistency, the branding, things like that. So it feels like it's one thing, even though it's coming from two different places. So hopefully that answers it to some degree.
I think one of the interesting things, and maybe this was what Mike was about to say, is that one of the very first projects that we did with PC Financial on Gatsby was actually not on Contentful. Like the PC hadn't bought Contentful yet, and so it was a more traditional CMS that we had configured to output JSON instead of HTML, and I won't go into the headaches that caused, but and the management of that. But what ended up happening is, like, when we're looking to move that over, we're really just changing those data connections and kind of migrating content models versus rebuilding everything from scratch. I think that's also one of the side kind of benefits that you have as well on the Gatsby side of things.
It gives you the ability to go incrementally as well. Instead of just migrating to a different CMS, as long as you can build a Gatsby layer or provide a GraphQL kind of output, you can retrigger and make sure that Gatsby is always connected to that GraphQL. And that's what we did with some of our projects initially, where we had our old CMS, we have the GraphQL layer on top of it. We rebuilt all of Gatsby, and then, like Doug said, we just started migrating to Contentful with the other part because of simplicity and ease of use.
Yeah. And so, Mark, from a content author point of view, like, all this technical stuff is great for, like Jason and Michael and I, but, from a content author point of view, and I just want to, publish my content to a website or mobile app or whatever, what's that integration look like? Because we've got this kind of separation of concerns happening.
Yeah, so there's kind of two ways that Contentful talks to other systems, and Jason sort of articulated the first, which is the core content APIs, and again, that's JSON working with large amounts of content back and forth. But then there is this concept of webhooks, and they're essentially a trigger, and that allows you to do things like, hey, I've created some content, and the moment I hit save, or the moment I'm going to go to publish it, that will then initiate a command to Gatsby saying, hey, build that content so that I can then preview it. So there's kind of these concepts of triggers and things like custom preview that then allow you to talk to those other systems and say, like, hey, go tell that other system to do something, and then I can then see that initiated from Contentful on our side as well.
So I think one of the interesting things is that, like, you talk about the idea of like custom preview. And so, for folks who haven't used Contentful before, if I can maybe take a swing at it, and then Mark, you can tell me if I got it right here, is that, like, you can hook it up to, I want to take a look at what this is going to look like on my website, or I might want to look at what it's going to look like on a mobile app, kind of, rendered out somewhere else. So, you're not necessarily losing some of those things as a content author that I might like, I'm going to put some content and I want to see what this looks like. That's always there and, available through the interface. So you don't need to know necessarily that there's a CI/CD pipeline and webhooks and all that stuff. As a business user trying to, manage my content and pivot quickly, it's fairly easy to configure that kind of stuff. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, I think it's correct, but there's a bit of a twist to that, and I've noticed this in some of the questions as well, as far as people coming from a world that's a little bit more page-based. Mm-hmm. I think that Contentful, from a technical perspective, allows a lot more flexibility, and what I would say is the authoring experience is quite different from a lot of traditional CMSs. I think there's some advantages and there's some, disadvantages or different ways of working with things. And I think some of those advantages are the web interface itself is built on modern frameworks. It's very fast. You can be, anywhere in the world, and a content author can be coming in and not be confronted with a very complex interface, not be confronted with slow front ends, and be able to go in very easily, understand how to make changes and make changes. And I think that's one of the things that we do see from Contentful is the typical user footprint with a lot of organizations is much, much bigger, because you can open that content creation process and sort of democratize that to larger parts of the organization, and they don't need to know a lot about what's going on in the background. And I think that's one of the big differences of Contentful versus the legacy CMS, where traditionally you as a content creator would need to know a lot about the CMS. You need to know where to go in, where to insert content, how to publish it, how to do page layout in a lot of those cases. And those things you don't have. Now, the flip side is, for those people who were power users in those legacy systems, and they are doing things like complex page layout, those tests in Contentful tend to be now those going to developers working with something like Gatsby, or people doing things like content modeling out some of those changes that they used to be visual changes, and they're now things like flags to indicate where content may go on a page or what channels it may go into. So it's a bit of a different experience there. But ultimately, I think what that enables is thinking of content in terms of atomic elements, where they are in the customer journey, what audiences you're targeting, and what channels you're targeting, rather than, hey, what does my page layout look like? And I think a lot of marketers are now starting to think in those customer experience terms rather than page layout terms.
Yeah, and I think that's been one of the challenges that we've seen is changing that mindset from people who might have traditionally been using a CMS in a different way. You can't just port that way of thinking over, or you're going to end up with unexpected results. I'll put it that way.
One of the coolest things that we've seen from content editors, and I know this is kind of geeky, but it's the scheduling of the content or posting of the content. I think that's been quite an amazing feature that we've thoroughly enjoyed, because we can actually have promotion windows in the middle of the night or whenever, and then the content editor will just schedule that task, and then it'll auto deploy all the way through the pipeline. And because we're using it not only for some of the Gatsby generation, we're also using some of for the versioning and terms and conditions. We can schedule everything together, and it will automatically get deployed as part of that release bundle.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a bunch of questions, and I think maybe we should turn it over to the audience, because I feel like they're chomping at the bit to get some of these answered. So I'm gonna read out. I'm gonna start with the Q&A panel here, folks, and I am gonna, like I said, I'm gonna try and get to those folks in the chat as well. I can see there's a bunch in there. So let me start with. I'm going to start with this one, answer live, right? So this question is, can you give an overview of how compliance approval fits into the deployment cycle in terms of content and code changes? And so I know for a fact that Contentful does have kind of like approval and workflow, et cetera. So maybe we can have Mark just talk about like the general answer, and then maybe Michael, you can talk about the specifics of how that's working at PCF.
Yeah. Oh, it's this is opening up a can of worms, because there's a lot of different ways to do that. So I think I'll answer it very high level, and then I'll probably flip to Michael because he's doing it in practice. But I think if you look at Contentful, there are abilities to do versions on individual content items, and then there's also this concept of environments. And so from a compliance perspective, if you're creating and updating individual assets, and that's kind of the typical flow for how things go, then you're sort of doing that approval on an individual asset. So you'd say, right, I'm going to create a content item. It's going to go, live, and somebody may have a workflow process for pushing that through. And if they've done an update, you're going to see what that update looks like in the version. Now, that said, I think a lot more organizations, especially for people driving, products or mobile apps, you want to be thinking of content in a much larger sense, where you're bundling up a bunch of changes. And, Michael said, yes, you can do scheduled changes within Contentful for individual items, and you can, but more often, if you're doing things like, hey, we're updating a version of our car navigation software, you're not going to be updating individual content items. You're going to bundle that up, and Contentful has this capability called environments, where you can then say, right, I'm going to, spin up a new environment, which is going to be my UAT, and, test that out, make sure that works. And then at that point, that UAT environment sort of gets promoted, and that's going to go live. And so, more often people are doing that type of compliance within a larger CI/CD process, combined with other bits of code that's going to be driving the mobile app or the car app or whatever. And those two things sort of work hand in hand.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's that pretty much covers a lot of the stuff that I was going to talk about as well. But we also supplement some of that. We also artifact or archive all the different artifacts that we generate as a means to going back to and seeing anything that happened or anything that broke. Contentful has a very rich version history for every individual item that you can actually compare and see the intricate details of what was linked and what was changed. And so for some of our items like terms and conditions, we actually have our own custom field we call versioning to identify major changes in the actual terms and conditions that the users agree to. So we can also have the capability of actually building on top of that. So we have both per revision or per save history, as well as a major kind of history for the individual terms and conditions.
Awesome. Thank you. And again, if there's like additional questions that you have, like when we're answering these, you can feel free to email us after and go from there. Okay, next question. This looks like this one will be for I love you changed your name to Jason. That's awesome. What plugins are recommended to fetch data from Contentful to Gatsby? And the one that's most known is Gatsby Source Contentful. So
yeah, as far as I know, that's the recommended one from my experience.
That's also from our experience as well. Yeah, that's the one that we typically use for directly connecting to Contentful. Mark, I didn't know if you had kind of insight on that as well.
No, same thing. Like that's the standard plugin on the Gatsby side, and then same thing. We have webhook templates, and to initiate that build to Gatsby, and that's out of the box. And then same thing. I think the preview is fairly standard. Putting in URL stubs for preview. So yeah, it's kind of there's to Gatsby anyways. There's a pretty well-trod way of doing it, and that's the way.
Yeah, especially if you're using Gatsby Cloud, I feel like that's probably like the path of least resistance, and you're going to get the most benefit out of it from our experience as well. So hopefully that answered that question for you. Okay. Can any of the panelists talk about how they're handling? So this is going to go to either Mark or Michael. Panelists talk about how they're handling content model changes in coordination with content editing teams. How do you pause editing in Contentful and test content model changes with devs?
Yeah, so maybe like last time, I'll cover this sort of at a high level, and then Michael can grab what he's actually doing at PC Financial. So I was mentioning earlier the Contentful capabilities around environments to sort of test those content changes. The nice thing is, in an environment, you can actually test out content model changes as well. And I think that's one of the things that's fairly unique about Contentful compared to most CMSs, is that you can actually test that model change in a sandbox, rather than a lot of other CMSs, you change a content model, it's changed everywhere. So that's sort of the first thing, is you can do that within a space. The second thing is content models across spaces themselves, by default are disconnected. And so, you can, as an organization, be working with a whole new space as you test out those changes, if you're not comfortable with doing that within an environment. And so really I think that's one of those things that Contentful sort of enables, is that ability to sort of do content model maintenance. And because those things do tend to change, as you're adding new channels, as you're adding new functionality, like, Michael's mentioning, like, hey, we need to add a flag for, major versions or minor versions. You can do that very easily without having to worry about breaking the whole process, because then you can do the CI/CD changes on that. Then you can do, to Jason's point about Gatsby, making sure that model change actually goes to Gatsby and it doesn't break anything on the front end. You've got more of those tools and checkpoints to make those modeling changes actually fairly painless.
Yeah, and I think you touched about, again, everything that I was going to mention as well. Some of the really cool functionality Contentful offers, as well as some of the CLI tools for structuring and modeling those changes. So right now, for example, when a developer wants to make a change, they can take the currently master environment that we use for our deployments, modify or create scripts to generate a subsequent environment that then can be tested and actually deployed and looked at by users or the end users, as well as actually you can log into the dashboard, select that environment, and modify the content and see the changes as they go live. So I think there's a lot of tooling that Contentful provides to really be able to experiment and test out new things. And that's one of the things that we really like about Contentful, because we pride ourselves in actually trying to experiment with new technologies and new ideas, and to kind of get some of the better approaches to how we do things.
Awesome. Awesome. So we did have I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I understand probably some people might have slotted an hour. So, if you have to drop off, thank you. For those that can stay, we're going to continue to answer questions probably for another 10 minutes or so. There's no way we're going to get through them all, but I'm going to make a commitment that I'm going to get as many of these answered as possible for you. So, this one's a pretty simple one, and I think I'll throw this one to Mike, and I can provide some additional answers after. Are there any good examples of entire pages being generated by Contentful and Gatsby? I would argue that there's a lot that PC Financial has, but maybe Mike, you can talk about ones that you're most proud of.
Sure. Actually, I think all of our PC Financial and PC Services are currently static buckets generated by Gatsby. I think with the exception of one, all of them are Contentful. So this includes PC Financial, PC Insurance, PC Mobile, PC Travel. I think there's a few other ones. There's the Mobile Shop, Gift of Choice. So it's a reusable way of actually generating these sites. And one thing that I'll mention as well, or expand on Doug's point, hopefully I'm not frozen again. I saw Doug hasn't moved an inch, so I wasn't sure. But one thing there you go, thank you. One thing I'll mention too is, as we start developing these sites and as we start developing these reusable patterns, our velocity is substantially increased. And what I would say is, when Doug said that in 2019, I think we did 2 sites. In 2020, we did 6 or 7 sites. That actually accelerated. So initially, we did, I think, 1 or 2 sites within the first 2 quarters. And then after that, we just kind of ramped up and were able to deliver a lot of sites very, very quickly, because we were using the exact same component libraries, the reusable React components, as well as kind of the known Contentful methodologies for content modeling.
Yeah, I think the big thing is that the team really got used to a new way of thinking and doing things too, which is, again, when we often talk about the tech, but really we're talking about, teams of people, be them technology or business, that are using this. And this is really important kind of thing to bear in mind as well. Okay, so we did have an email question. I think it's a good one. So what benefits did Headless allow that would have been otherwise unachievable? So I'm going to take a swing at this one first, and then maybe I'll just put it out to the panel to talk about. But I would argue that nothing's not achievable without time or money. It's really about the amount of time and money and effort and where you want to spend your effort. That's the important thing to remember. I'll give the example of our first Gatsby example was not on Contentful. But as Mike has mentioned, we were able to accelerate what we were doing and how we're doing it by using Contentful. So, same team, same front end stack, but we were able to do things more quickly. Are there things that are unachievable? I would argue no. It's just about that there is anything's achievable with the right tech stack and money. It's just a matter of like, where are you willing to spend your time and money? I think that's really more where it's at. So I don't know if Mark or Jason or Michael want to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, I'll get into the weeds a little bit on some of the specifics of that. Like, if you look at a lot of, there's a few legacy content management systems. I'm thinking of one in particular. I'm not going to name it. We have a client running Contentful for a lot of their product stuff, and they're running this other system for their publicly facing website. And the issue is they couldn't use that other system to drive their product because the content wasn't atomic and granular enough. And that other system did have, on paper, a headless API that they could use, but the JSON output really wasn't in a format that made sense. There was no way to kind of query linked, child items. And so, as a result, they're getting these big blobs of information and having to sort of stitch it together rather than getting nice targeted queries with GraphQL query, for example. And so because of that, the API itself kind of drove how the content was modeled, because they couldn't get content out in a granular fashion. They didn't structure it in a granular fashion. And so they weren't able to, really drive some of the interesting use cases as far as personalization and structured content and, reusing to multiple channels and all these sort of things. And so again, to Douglas's point, like, yes, they had an API. Yes, it was headless. Yes, you could do these things. But if they actually wanted to accomplish their use case, they would have really had to have essentially built another CMS on top of that system to kind of enable them to aggregate and build the queries that you could just easily do out of the box with Contentful.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, let's just do a quick, it looks like we might have time for maybe one, maybe two more. Let me just grab a question here that we can answer in that time. Okay, here's one. So are you seeing the concept of headless CMS used in the context of a broader microservices and process-oriented API strategy, or just focus on the CMS? So I'll take a swing at this one, and then again, I'll just put it out to the group. I would argue that that typically we're seeing it's not just the CMS, so especially on kind of more complex sites. But I think we mentioned before, I think it was Jason that mentioned before, like there's always an integration for hiring, right? So like there's some sort of hiring system linked to job applications or whatever that the HR team is using. So there's always kind of like different services that are being aggregated. This is one of the reasons we really like and started using Gatsby, is because we had this exact problem. But I'll throw it out to the group kind of beyond that.
Yeah, I'd really quickly say yes, it's across the industry. So it's not just CMS, it's digital asset management, it's marketing automation, it's tools that relate to customer data. All of these things are really becoming SaaS first and microservice first, and that's really why we're seeing this massive take up, allowing us to really have these partnerships and drive these things quickly. If those things didn't exist across the industry on the whole, you wouldn't be getting that sort of quick time to value that everybody's seeing.
Yeah, and to that point, I think Gatsby, if I'm looking correctly, has over 700 source plugins right now in the wild. So anywhere from CMSs to file system to like you can source from GitHub directly if you wanted like to pull change logs in or like whatever you want. E-commerce is a big one right now too. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, one more question. Let me see if I can grab one from the chat, which always requires, I should have worn some glasses of some sort. So here's an interesting one. I'm new to Contentful and static page generation. but wanted to ask how this stack would handle sites that needed to have periodic updates that needed an approval workflow. So we talked a little bit about the workflow, but the idea of periodic updates, et cetera, maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I guess I'll take a crack at it. I don't know, Michael or Jason, if you want to do the same. Periodic updates, if they're sort of timed updates, there's scheduling functionality within Contentful. Currently, I think some of the more advanced stuff for scheduling is in early access program. So because we are a SaaS vendor, any new functionality we kind of roll out through early access first. So depending upon the nature of that scheduling, some of that may be EAP, some of that may be live already, and that's also true for some of the workflow stuff. I don't know, Michael, if you want to take a crack at how you're doing it at Loblaws, because you did mention that as a use case, or sorry, PC Financial.
Yeah, so we love the scheduling portion of it, and like having it tied to, I think there's some of the bundling of the releases and the ability to just really easily deploy a series or a bit of content. So we've totally leveraged all those tools, and I hope that if at some point they'll move away from the early access. I didn't really realize they're early access, but I didn't know that part. They're pretty awesome.
Okay, one last question, and this one is maybe just like a one thought from each of you. And so like we've talked about a lot of the benefits, but like as with any choice that you make, there's always kind of like something, what's a drawback that might happen. So from each of our perspectives, identify disadvantages using the stack, some things that you could not do, or when it's a good idea to do this or not in another case. So I might take a stab at that one just because I've kind of seen this, and then maybe we can throw it out to each of you. I would say probably one of the disadvantages is maybe a little bit more on the people side of things, especially, I think we mentioned it before, this idea that like trying to do things like square peg round hole, unless everybody is kind of aligned with, maybe changing how their day-to-day works, from not dramatically, but to some perspective, and you're trying to kind of do things in the way you used to with a new set of tools, it's not necessarily gonna work. It can be a little bit confusing at first to get started, because whenever something changes, I mean, you can make a minor change to a website and like the internet loses its mind because something changed. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, is a little bit more on the human side of things versus the technology. But I'll see if anyone has a different opinion. Maybe we'll start with Michael first, just to see if there's kind of anything that you're like, I wish, or it's like I missed that, or.
Yeah, so the only thing that I will say, the biggest, I guess, pain point about the headless stack and the headless way of doing it is the investment in terms of DevOps and making sure that your build pipelines are built correctly. We as a bank actually have to build and maintain our own DevOps pipelines. But if you do reach out and use the tools like Gatsby Preview and Gatsby Cloud, it makes that process a lot more seamless and a lot more reusable and usable. But for us, that original kind of changing in the way that we change content, and then it has to run a pipeline and then it gets deployed. That was a bit of a big pill to swallow, but eventually once we got on and optimized those pipelines to run really quickly, it became a lot easier to kind of explain that.
Awesome. Jason, is there kind of something that you're like, oh man, I wish?
I don't know. So the projects I've built on Gatsby have been some of the, I think, most like pleasant developer experience projects I've built. I've been in the WordPress space for a decade, and like working on Gatsby like is so much, I don't know, templating with React and pulling from any data source and being able to use components that you use on multiple projects, like just so many efficiencies, and like the tooling to tell me when I'm doing something wrong. I don't know, it's just been incredible to use Gatsby.
And it's funny, there's one of the questions in here that it's not really a question, it's more of a statement. This is from one of the audience members, said, just wanted to throw it out there. We're running SolarisBank.com on Gatsby, Contentful, and Netlify. And so plus, various other data sources, et cetera. And as a developer, I'm very, very happy with the setup. So I think, you're not alone in that. And I would argue, I have a team of people here who also feel that way. So.
Yeah, and I'll echo that as well. I think the way the solutions have been architected, they're very developer friendly. If you are an organization that has a CI/CD process, then you would benefit from something like a headless CMS. If you don't know what a CI/CD process is, then you're probably going to struggle with the differences and the benefits, because they won't be as obvious to you as an organization. I would say by far the biggest learning pain is that shift from thinking about marketing and thinking about your website in terms of pages to thinking about atomic content. And even those companies that are sold on Contentful from like a SaaS perspective and an API perspective, sometimes they go and they model out their content model in order to replicate that page experience, and they're not really thinking about their content from an omni-channel perspective. And that's often the hardest thing to get your head around, rather than the technical things. It's just, hey, what is my marketing look like? What does my content footprint look like? And then, again, I'm not building pages, I'm targeting content towards an audience, or I'm targeting content towards a channel. And, what's my smallest unit of content that I can, really be thinking with and working with that can be reused across those multiple things. That's the big mind shift. And if you're not there yet as an organization, then you're going to struggle, because you're sort of going against the metaphor of how all these things work together and play together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Mark. Thank you for that. That's kind of what we've seen as well, kind of across the board. So we are running short on time. So I did want to give everyone on the panel, first of all, thank you for joining us here on the first Trade Talk of 2021 that we're going to be doing. I really appreciate all of your times, fantastic insights. It's great to chat with a room of experts like this. I always feel humbled to be able to talk to you guys and learn. I always learn things. I also wanted to say thanks to Contentful, Gatsby, and PC Financial for lending us your time, if you will. It's I think it's been valuable for me, and hopefully for the audience as well. Thanks, of course, to the audience, for joining us. I think we had a good group of people here, some great questions. And I am going to get those questions answered, and we will send that out to everybody who signed up for the webinar. So even for those who are watching this as a recording after, or didn't get to attend, hopefully we can answer some of those questions for you. And thank you to the ThrowWorks team. You can see they're kind of they're in my top left corner, being quiet there, but they put this all together behind the scenes so that we could come in and do this talk. So with that all said, Mark, Jason, and Michael, maybe, a quick kind of, like if there's a closing thought you have, one thing that you wanted to leave the audience with, maybe we could just talk about those things. So maybe Mark, we can start with you.
Oh, geez. Closing thoughts. Yeah, I think the big thing is, as I mentioned, that shift in how organizations work. And I think there's part of it is thinking about marketing in terms of experience and channels. And another part of it is also how you relate to your development organization. I think these technologies lend themselves to more agile ways of working. And if you're, again, an organization internally that, has an external agency building your CMS and they sort of flip it over the wall, with updates every 6 months, that again is also going to be, something else that you need to change. But my closing thought is, this is the time to do it. Everybody is changing how they have to deliver to their customers in terms of service and in terms of marketing. And we're all switching to sort of agile ways due to COVID and remote and all these things. And so, it's all stuff that people should have been doing for the last few years, but it really is sort of coming to a head now. So that's my closing thought.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. That's great. Jason, let's go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, just closing thoughts for me is just check out Gatsby Cloud. But yeah, and just Gatsby in general. If speed, security, performance, and consistency are on your mind, I think you'll have a blast using Gatsby.
Oh, I'll get one in there as well. Contentful has a free community edition, so you can try that out for free for developers, free for nonprofit, out of the box connectors and starter kits with Gatsby. So it all lines up nicely. So yeah, you can get started and start to learn for nothing, no time.
Yeah. Same with Gatsby Cloud. There's a free tier there as well, and so
same with PC Financial. It's a free credit card.
There you go. Free is the closing thought for all.
So I guess from a PC Financial perspective, the usage of this stack has been kind of game changing for us. We went from a heavily tied CMS that wasn't highly reliable, highly available, and we've reduced our operational costs by going to a bucket. We've improved our security posture. We also dramatically improved our developer experience and allowed for a lot more experimentation within our pods and developers. And we've also worked towards optimizing and by reusing shared components and shared libraries to really optimize the process of generating a new site. And I think we have a few new ones coming up in the new year as well that we're excited to deliver. But using the stack has been phenomenal for our delivery of any new tools. So, and like I said, PCMC is a free card, so apply anytime.
My shout out for you was going to be Michael has, put together a really fantastic team. So if you're, hearing this and my company is not going to do that, you should go talk to Michael, and especially if you're a developer.
Yeah,
well,
for sure.
Thank everyone again for attending. And like I said, we will do our best to answer all these questions. And this webinar will be available for you to watch later. So thank you everyone again, and stay safe.